The morning sun cast long shadows across the reservation as 18-year-old Marcus stood at the edge of the cemetery, clutching a handful of sage in his trembling fingers. The earth was still fresh over his grandfather's grave, dark soil that seemed to hold secrets as deep as the old man's weathered eyes once had. 3 days had passed since Joseph Crow Feather had drawn his last breath, and Marcus felt as lost as a child in a winter storm. The reservation stretched endlessly around him, dotted with small houses and trailers that had seen better days. This was the only world Marcus had ever known. These rolling hills of Northern California where his Modoc ancestors had lived and died for generations. But now, with his grandfather gone, everything felt different. The familiar landscape seemed to whisper questions he couldn't answer. Marcus had been living with his grandfather since he was 7 years old, when his parents died in a car accident on the winding mountain roads. Joseph Crow Feather had taken him in without question, raising him with the old ways and the new world's demands. The old man had been everything to Marcus: father, teacher, storyteller, and the keeper of family history. As he walked back toward the small house where he'd grown up, Marcus noticed how quiet everything seemed. The neighbors who usually called out greetings kept their distance, their eyes filled with something that looked like pity mixed with fear. Mrs. Standing Bear, who lived next door, quickly turned away when she saw him coming. Even the tribal council members who had attended the funeral seemed to avoid looking directly at him. Inside the house, boxes of his grandfather's belongings waited to be sorted. The tribal housing authority had given Marcus 30 days to decide what to keep before they assigned the house to another family. At 18, he was considered an adult, but he felt anything but grown up as he stared at the overwhelming task ahead. The living room held a lifetime of memories. His grandfather's favorite chair sat empty by the window, still holding the impression of the old man's body. Books about Modoc history and tribal law filled shelves along the walls. Traditional baskets his grandmother had woven decades before his birth decorated every surface. And everywhere there were photographs, some old and faded, others more recent, all telling the story of a family Marcus was only beginning to understand. He picked up a framed photo of his grandfather as a young man, maybe in his 20s. Joseph Crow Feather had been handsome then, with sharp features and confident eyes. He wore a military uniform Marcus had never seen before. When he'd asked about his grandfather's service, the old man had always changed the subject, saying only that some wars were better forgotten. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Marcus saw a woman approaching, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the tribal historian who worked at the cultural center. She was white, but she'd been working with the tribe for over 15 years, helping to preserve Modoc traditions and oral histories. His grandfather had respected her, which meant something in a community where trust didn't come easily. "Marcus," she said softly when he opened the door, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was a remarkable man." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Dr. Mitchell stepped inside, looking around the room with the careful eye of someone who understood the weight of history. "I came to talk to you about something important," she continued. "Your grandfather contacted me a few weeks before he passed. He said there were things you needed to know, things he hadn't been able to tell you while he was alive." Marcus felt his heart skip. "What kind of things?" Dr. Mitchell reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "He asked me to give you this after the funeral. He said you'd know what to do with it when you were ready." The envelope felt heavy in Marcus's hands, though it couldn't have weighed more than a few ounces. His name was written across the front in his grandfather's careful handwriting, but underneath it were words in the Modoc language that he couldn't quite translate. "Did he tell you what's inside?" Marcus asked. "No, but he did say something strange. He told me that our family's real story was buried deeper than anyone knew, and that you were the only one who could decide whether it should stay buried or come to light." Marcus stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandfather had always been careful with his words, never speaking without purpose. If he'd left instructions for Marcus to receive this after his death, it had to be important. "There's something else," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've been researching your family's history for a book about the Modoc people, and I've found some inconsistencies in the records. Things that don't quite add up." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Well, for starters, there are gaps in your grandfather's military record, And some of the stories he told about your family's role in the Modoc War don't match the historical documents I've found. It's as if someone deliberately obscured parts of your family's past. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The Modoc War had ended more than a century ago, when his people had finally been forced to surrender to the U.S. Army after years of resistance. His grandfather had always spoken of it with pride, telling stories of brave warriors who had fought to protect their homeland. But now Dr. Mitchell was suggesting that those stories might not be the whole truth. Why would someone do that? Marcus asked. I don't know, but your grandfather seemed to think you'd be able to figure it out. She looked at the envelope in his hands. Maybe the answers are in there. After Dr. Mitchell left, Marcus sat alone in the gathering darkness, the envelope still unopened on the table before him. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of the reservation at evening. Dogs barking, children playing, the distant hum of television sets. But inside the house, silence pressed against him like a living thing. He thought about his grandfather's final days, how the old man had seemed anxious about something, often staring out the window as if he were watching for someone who never came. There had been phone calls late at night, conversations conducted in whispers and the old language that Marcus only partially understood. When he'd asked about them, his grandfather had simply said he was taking care of old business. Now Marcus wondered if that old business had something to do with the envelope. His grandfather had always taught him that knowledge was sacred, that some truths were too dangerous to share carelessly. But he'd also taught him that running from truth was the same as living a lie. As darkness fell completely over the reservation, Marcus finally reached for the envelope. Whatever secrets his grandfather had kept, whatever truth had been buried with the generations before him, it was time to face it. He was 18 now, a man by any measure, and the keeper of his family's story whether he wanted to be or not. The envelope crackled as he tore it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Inside, he found several documents and a letter in his grandfather's handwriting. The first line made his blood run cold. Marcus, if you are reading this, then the time has come for you to learn who you really are. Marcus read the letter 3 times before the words began to make sense. His grandfather's careful handwriting told a story that seemed impossible, yet every instinct told him it was true. According to the letter, Marcus wasn't just Joseph Crowfeather's grandson. He was the last living descendant of Captain Jack, the legendary Modoc leader who had led the resistance against the U.S. Army in the 1870s. The official record stated that Captain Jack had been executed in 1873, his bloodline ending with his death. But Joseph's letter revealed a different truth. Captain Jack had a son, born in secret to a young woman who had fled the reservation during the final battles. That child had been hidden among distant relatives, his true identity buried to protect him from those who might seek revenge against Captain Jack's family. Marcus set the letter down with shaking hands. Captain Jack wasn't just a historical figure to the Modoc people. He was a symbol of resistance, courage, and the fight for their homeland. Some saw him as a hero, others as a troublemaker who had brought unnecessary suffering to their people. But everyone knew his story, and everyone had an opinion about his legacy. The other documents in the envelope included birth certificates, marriage records, and what appeared to be a map drawn on aged paper. The map showed locations around the reservation that Marcus recognized, but there were symbols and notations he didn't understand. One location was marked with a red X and a note in the Modoc language that roughly translated to, "Where the truth sleeps." Sleep didn't come easily that night. Marcus lay in his grandfather's bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he'd learned. If the letter was true, it explained so many things. Why his grandfather had always been treated with such respect by the tribal elders, why certain conversations stopped when Marcus entered a room, why his family had always lived slightly apart from the main community, but it also raised disturbing questions. Why had this secret been kept for so long? What was his grandfather afraid might happen if the truth came out? And why was Marcus being told now when he was barely 18 and felt completely unprepared for such a burden? The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Marcus was sorting through his grandfather's papers when he heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, he saw 3 tribal council members getting out of a black SUV, their faces grim with purpose. Behind them, a second vehicle carried 2 men Marcus didn't recognize, older white men in expensive suits who looked distinctly out of place on the reservation. Tribal Chairman Robert, Winters knocked on the door with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus had known Chairman Winters his entire life, but the man's expression today was colder than Marcus had ever seen it. "Marcus, we need to talk," Chairman Winters said without preamble. "May we come in?" Marcus stepped aside, feeling suddenly very young as the 5 men filled his small living room. The strangers introduced themselves as government officials from some agency Marcus had never heard of, their business cards heavy with official seals and titles that meant nothing to him. "We understand your grandfather left you some family documents," one of the officials said. He was a thin man with sharp eyes who seemed to take in every detail of the room. "We're here to help you understand their significance." "What kind of significance?" Marcus asked. Though he suspected he already knew, Chairman Winters shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, your grandfather was a respected member of our community, but he also carried some complicated family history. History that could be disruptive if it came to light." "Disruptive how?" The second official, a heavy-set man with graying hair, leaned forward. "Son, your family's past intersects with some ongoing legal matters. Land claims, casino rights, federal recognition issues. If certain historical claims were to surface, it could complicate negotiations that have taken years to develop." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. "You're talking about Captain Jack, aren't you?" The room fell silent. Chairman Winters closed his eyes briefly, as if Marcus had just confirmed his worst fears. "Your grandfather told you," Winters said. It wasn't a question. Some of it. Maybe not all of it. Marcus looked around the room at the serious faces. "But I'm starting to think there's a lot more to this story." The thin official reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Marcus, we're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement. Enough to pay for college, buy a house, start a business. All you have to do is sign an agreement stating that you won't pursue any historical claims related to your family's past." "What kind of claims?" "The kind that could reopen treaties that were settled decades ago," Chairman Winters said. "The kind that could destabilize everything our people have built here." Marcus stared at the folder. Even from across the room, he could see it was thick with legal documents and what looked like bank papers. The amount they were offering was probably more money than he'd ever seen in his life. "What if I don't sign?" The officials exchanged glances. "Then this becomes more complicated for everyone," the heavy-set man said. "Historical claims have a way of attracting attention from people who don't necessarily have the tribe's best interests at heart. Lawyers, activists, journalists. Once they get involved, things can spiral out of control quickly." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality," Chairman Winters said. "Marcus, I knew your grandfather for 40 years. He was a good man who understood that sometimes protecting people means keeping certain truths buried. He never intended for you to carry this burden." But Marcus thought about his grandfather's letter, about the careful way the old man had prepared these documents for him to find. Joseph Crow Feather had been many things, but he'd never been careless. If he'd wanted the truth to stay buried, he wouldn't have left Marcus the letter at all. "I need time to think about this," Marcus said. "Time isn't something we have a lot of," the thin official replied. "Word has a way of getting out about these things. The longer you wait, the more complicated it becomes." After the men left, Marcus sat alone with their folder of documents in his grandfather's envelope. The contrast was striking. The government papers were clean, official, and filled with legal language designed to obscure rather than clarify. His grandfather's documents were personal, handwritten, and spoke of truth rather than convenience. He thought about Dr. Mitchell's research, about the inconsistencies she'd found in the historical records. If his family really was descended from Captain Jack, it would explain why those records had been altered. It would also explain why powerful people were willing to pay him to stay quiet about it. But there was something else, something that nagged at the back of his mind. The map his grandfather had left showed several locations around the reservation, but one of them wasn't on tribal land at all. It was located about 20 miles away, on what was now private property owned by a large corporation. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about the final battles of the Modoc War, about sacred places where important events had occurred. But this location on the map wasn't mentioned in any of the official histories he knew. If it was significant enough for his grandfather to mark it, there had to be a reason. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't sign the government papers, at least not yet. But he also wouldn't make any public claims about his heritage until he understood more about what he'd inherited. His grandfather had trusted him with this secret for a reason, and Marcus owed it to the old man's memory to find out what that reason was. He studied the map again, tracing the route to the marked location with his finger. Tomorrow he would drive out there and see what, if anything, remained of whatever his grandfather had wanted him to find. The truth was waiting somewhere in those hills, and Marcus was finally ready to face it, no matter how dangerous it might prove to be. The old pickup truck rattled along the dirt road as Marcus followed his grandfather's map deeper into the hills beyond the reservation. Morning mist clung to the valleys, making the landscape look mysterious and ancient. He'd borrowed the truck from his friend Tommy, claiming he needed to clear his head after the funeral. It wasn't entirely a lie. His head was definitely spinning from everything he'd learned in the past few days. The map led him away from the main highways, down increasingly narrow roads that seemed forgotten by time. This part of Northern California still looked much as it had when his ancestors had roamed these hills freely, before borders and property lines had carved up the land into pieces owned by distant corporations and wealthy individuals. After an hour of driving, Marcus reached the area marked on his grandfather's map. The road ended at a locked gate bearing signs that warned against trespassing. Beyond the gate, he could see hills covered with oak trees and rocky outcroppings that matched the symbols his grandfather had drawn. This was definitely the right place, but getting inside would require either permission he didn't have or trespassing on private property. Marcus parked the truck and studied the fence line. It was well maintained but not impossible to get around. After walking along it for several hundred yards, he found a spot where a winter storm had brought down a large tree, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The land beyond the fence felt different somehow, as if it held memories that refused to fade. Marcus had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about the old days, about places where important events had occurred, and this felt like one of those places. The air seemed thicker here, charged with the weight of history. Following the map's directions, Marcus climbed toward a ridge marked with 3 triangular symbols. The terrain was rough, covered with loose rocks and thick brush that caught at his clothes. But as he climbed higher, he began to notice things that didn't belong to the natural landscape. Stones arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Depressions in the earth that might once have been fire pits. Near the top of the ridge, he found what he was looking for. Hidden among a cluster of large boulders was an opening that led into what appeared to be a small cave. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown brush. But when Marcus cleared away the debris, he could see that someone had worked to hide this place deliberately. Inside the cave, his flashlight revealed walls covered with symbols painted in red ochre. Some were recognizable Modoc pictographs that his grandfather had taught him to read, but others were unfamiliar. The cave wasn't large, maybe 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but every surface was covered with these mysterious markings. At the back of the cave, Marcus found what his grandfather had really wanted him to discover. Wrapped in oiled leather and hidden behind a loose rock was a metal box about the size of a small suitcase. The box was old but well preserved, and it opened with a key that had been included among his grandfather's papers. Inside the box were documents that made Marcus's heart race. There were military dispatches from the 1870s, written communications between U.S. Army officers and civilian officials, and most shocking of all, a series of photographs that showed things Marcus had never seen in any history book. The photographs were grainy and aged, but they clearly showed scenes from the final days of the Modoc War. Some depicted the famous lava beds where Captain Jack's band had made their last stand, but others showed locations Marcus didn't recognize. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It showed a group of Modoc people, including women and children, who appeared to be fleeing across open ground. But it was a handwritten journal that contained the most disturbing revelations. Written by a cavalry officer named Lieutenant William Morrison, the journal described events that had been deliberately omitted from official reports. According to Morrison's account, the final battle hadn't ended with Captain Jack's capture as the history books claimed. There had been a second group of Modoc people who had escaped the Army's roundup, led by one of Captain Jack's trusted lieutenants. The journal described how this group had included Captain Jack's pregnant wife and several other women and children. They had fled north hoping to reach safety with friendly tribes in Oregon. But they had been pursued by a special detachment of soldiers under orders to ensure that no witnesses to certain events survived. Morrison's handwriting became increasingly erratic as he described what happened next. The fleeing Modoc group had been cornered in a canyon about 50 miles from the main battleground. What followed, according to the lieutenant's account, was not a battle but a massacre. The soldiers had killed everyone they could find, including the women and children, and buried the bodies in a mass grave. But the journal revealed that one person had escaped, a young woman who had given birth just days before the massacre. She had hidden with her newborn son while her family and friends were murdered around her. After the soldiers left, she had taken the infant and disappeared into the wilderness. Marcus's hands shook as he read the final entries in Morrison's journal. The lieutenant had been haunted by what he'd witnessed, writing that he could no longer sleep without seeing the faces of the dead. He had tried to report the massacre to his superiors, but had been ordered to keep silent about it. The official reports would state that all of Captain Jack's followers had been captured or killed in the lava beds. The massacre in the canyon would never be acknowledged. The woman who had escaped was identified in the journal as Winona, Captain Jack's youngest wife. According to Morrison's final entry, she had been only 16 years old when she witnessed the murder of her family. Her son, if he had survived, would have been Captain Jack's only living heir. Marcus set the journal down and stared at the cave walls around him. The pictographs suddenly made more sense. They weren't just random symbols, but a record, a way of preserving the truth that had been buried by official lies. His grandfather hadn't just inherited a secret family history. He had inherited the responsibility of bearing witness to a war crime that had been covered up for more than a century. The implications were staggering. If this evidence was authentic, it proved that the U.S. government had not only lied about the end of the Modoc War, but had actively covered up the murder of civilians. It also proved that Captain Jack's bloodline hadn't ended with his execution. It had continued through his son, hidden among the Modoc people who had survived. But as Marcus began to understand the magnitude of what he'd discovered, he also began to understand why his grandfather had kept it secret for so long. This wasn't just family history. It was evidence of a crime that powerful people had every reason to keep buried. The government officials who had visited him the day before suddenly seemed much more threatening. They hadn't just been offering him money to stay quiet about a genealogical claim. They had been trying to prevent him from uncovering evidence of a massacre. Marcus carefully photographed every page of the journal with his phone, making sure to capture every detail. He also documented the pictographs on the cave walls and took pictures of the other documents in the box. Whatever happened next, he wanted to make sure this evidence was preserved. As he prepared to leave the cave, Marcus noticed something else hidden in the back corner, a small bundle wrapped in cloth that felt different from the other items. When he unwrapped it, he found a piece of Captain Jack's clothing, a beaded shirt that had somehow been preserved for over a century. The shirt was decorated with traditional Modoc designs that told the story of a people's connection to their land. Holding the shirt, Marcus felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. He was no longer just an 18-year-old orphan trying to figure out his future. He was the keeper of a truth that could change how people understood a crucial period in American history. But he was also a target, marked by powerful people who would do almost anything to ensure that truth stayed buried. As he climbed back down the ridge toward his truck, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He wouldn't sign the government's papers, and he wouldn't stay quiet about what he'd discovered. But he also wouldn't act alone. His grandfather had trusted him with this secret, but Joseph Crow Feather had also taught him that some burdens were too heavy for one person to carry. Marcus drove back to the reservation with his mind racing and his hands gripping the steering wheel, tight enough to hurt. The evidence he'd found in the cave changed everything. But it also made him a target for people with resources and connections far beyond anything he could imagine. He needed help, but he wasn't sure who he could trust. Back at his grandfather's house, Marcus spread the photographs and documents across the kitchen table, trying to organize them in a way that made sense. The journal entries were damning enough on their own, but combined with the official military dispatches and the pictographs from the cave, they painted a picture of systematic cover-up that had lasted for more than a century. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, asking if he'd like to meet for coffee. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment before responding that yes, he'd very much like to talk with her. If anyone could help him understand the historical significance of what he'd found, it would be the tribal historian who had spent years studying Modoc culture and documenting oral traditions. They met that evening at a small diner in the nearest town, about 15 miles from the reservation. Dr. Mitchell chose a corner booth where they could talk privately, and Marcus could see the concern in her eyes as he pulled out printed copies of some of the documents he'd discovered. "Marcus, where did you find these?" she asked after scanning the first few pages of Lieutenant Morrison's journal. "In a place my grandfather marked on a map." "Dr. Mitchell, if these documents are real—" "They are real," she said quietly, studying the military dispatches with the eye of someone who had examined hundreds of similar documents. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, these are authentic 19th century military records. "But Marcus, do you understand what this means?" Marcus nodded grimly. "It means the government has been lying about the Modoc War for over 100 years. It means they covered up a massacre of women and children. And it means I'm probably in serious trouble for finding this." Dr. Mitchell looked around the diner nervously before leaning closer. "There's something I need to tell you. After I left your house yesterday, I was contacted by some people claiming to be federal researchers. They asked me detailed questions about my conversation with you and about your grandfather's documents. When I told them I couldn't discuss ongoing research, they became insistent." "What kind of insistent?" "The kind that made me check my locks twice before going to bed last night. Marcus, these people know you found something, and they're not going to simply offer you money and hope you go away. The evidence you've discovered could rewrite American history textbooks and open the government up to massive legal liability." Marcus felt his stomach sink. "So what do I do? If I come forward with this, they'll probably find a way to discredit me or make the evidence disappear. If I stay quiet, I'm letting them get away with covering up murder." Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, thinking, there might be a third option. What if we don't release everything at once? What if we start by documenting what we've found and building an unshakable case before going public? "What do you mean?" "I mean we need more than just your grandfather's documents, as compelling as they are. We need corroborating evidence from other sources, archaeological evidence from the massacre site, military records from other archives, maybe even DNA evidence from descendants." Marcus thought about this. "The journal mentions where the massacre took place, a canyon about 50 miles north of the lava beds. If there really are bodies buried there, then we need to find that site and document it properly. But Marcus, this isn't something we can do alone. We need archaeologists, historians, maybe even forensic anthropologists, and we need legal protection before we start digging into something this sensitive. Who can we trust?" Dr. Mitchell pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I know some people at the university, professors who specialize in Native American history, and who have experience dealing with sensitive archaeological sites. There's also a civil rights lawyer in San Francisco who has handled cases involving government cover-ups of crimes against Native Americans." As they talked, Marcus began to feel hope for the first time since finding the documents. Dr. Mitchell was right. He couldn't handle this alone, but he didn't have to. There were people who had dedicated their careers to uncovering historical truths and fighting injustice. But their conversation was interrupted when Marcus noticed a familiar, black SUV pulling into the diner's parking lot. Through the window he could see Chairman Winters getting out of the passenger seat, followed by the two government officials who had visited him the day before. "We need to go," Marcus said urgently. "Now." Dr. Mitchell followed his gaze and immediately understood. They gathered up the documents and headed for the back exit, but they weren't fast enough. As they reached the rear door, it opened to reveal a third man Marcus hadn't seen before, younger than the others, with the kind of military bearing that suggested he wasn't just a bureaucrat. "Mr. Crowfeather," the man said politely but firmly, "my name is Agent Reynolds. I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Marcus and Dr. Mitchell found themselves escorted back to the corner booth, where Chairman Winters and the other officials were waiting. The diner's other customers seemed to have mysteriously disappeared, and Marcus noticed that one of the agents had positioned himself near the front door. "Marcus," Chairman Winters said, his voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and concern, "you were supposed to think about our offer, not go digging around on private property." "How did you know where I went?" Agent Reynolds smiled thinly. "We've been monitoring your grandfather's activities for years, Mr. Crowfeather. We know about the cave, about the documents, about everything he's been hiding. The question now is what we do about it. Dr. Mitchell spoke up. What you're talking about is suppressing evidence of war crimes. Historical crimes, but crimes nonetheless. What we're talking about, the heavyset official said, is protecting national security interests that are far more important than historical accuracy. The events described in those documents, if they occurred at all, happened over a century ago. The people involved are long dead. Dredging up ancient history serves no purpose except to create problems for everyone involved. Marcus felt anger building in his chest. Those people who died in that canyon were my family, my ancestors. And you're telling me their murder doesn't matter because it happened a long time ago? What I'm telling you, Agent Reynolds said, is that you have a choice to make. You can take the settlement we've offered, sign the agreement and live a comfortable life. Or you can try to fight this and discover just how difficult life can become for someone who possesses classified historical information. Classified? It's been over 100 years. Some information remains classified indefinitely, especially when it involves ongoing national security concerns. The land where that massacre allegedly took place is now part of a sensitive federal facility. Any attempt to conduct archaeological investigations there would be considered an act of terrorism. The threat was clear, but Marcus found himself thinking about his grandfather's words from the letter. Some truths are too important to stay buried forever. Joseph Crowfeather had risked his own safety to preserve this evidence, trusting that someday his grandson would be brave enough to act on it. I need time to think, Marcus said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, Agent Reynolds replied. After that, we'll assume you've made your choice and we'll proceed accordingly. As they prepared to leave, Chairman Winters pulled Marcus aside. Son, I knew your grandfather well and I respected him. But he carried this burden for 70 years without ever acting on it. Don't you think there might be a reason for that? Marcus looked at the older man, seeing genuine concern beneath the political calculation. Maybe he was waiting for someone young enough and foolish enough to believe that justice still matters. That night, alone in his grandfather's house, Marcus sat surrounded by the evidence of a century-old cover-up and tried to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Outside, he could see unmarked cars parked at both ends of the street, their occupants making no effort to hide their surveillance. The message was clear: he was being watched, and his choices were being carefully monitored. But as he looked at the photographs of the massacre site and read Lieutenant Morrison's agonized account of what he'd witnessed, Marcus knew what his grandfather would have wanted him to do. The truth was worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. Marcus barely slept that night. Every sound outside seemed amplified: a car door closing, footsteps on gravel, the whisper of wind through the trees. By dawn, he had made his decision. He wouldn't sign the government's agreement, but he also wouldn't act recklessly. If he was going to expose the truth about the massacre, he needed to do it in a way that would make the evidence impossible to suppress or discredit. Before the agents could return, Marcus called Dr. Mitchell from a payphone at the gas station, using a number she'd given him the night before. They arranged to meet at the Tribal Cultural Center, where she worked, figuring it would be harder for the government officials to intimidate them in a public place surrounded by tribal employees. When Marcus arrived at the Cultural Center, he found Dr. Mitchell waiting with two other people, a middle-aged woman with graying hair who introduced herself as Professor Elena Rodriguez from UC Berkeley, and a younger man named David Kim, who worked for a civil rights organization in San Francisco. Sarah called us last night, Professor Rodriguez explained. What you've discovered could be one of the most significant archaeological finds related to the Indian Wars period. But David is right that we need to be very careful about how we proceed. David Kim leaned forward, his expression serious. I've handled cases like this before, where historical evidence threatens to expose government wrongdoing. The pattern is always the same. First, they try to buy your silence, then they try to discredit you, and if that doesn't work, they find ways to make your life very difficult. So what do? We document everything, create multiple copies, and establish a network of allies before we go public, Professor Rodriguez said. I have contacts at universities across the country who specialize in this kind of historical research. If we can get several independent historians to verify the authenticity of your documents, it becomes much harder for anyone to dismiss them as forgeries. David Kim nodded. And I can help you establish legal protections. There are whistleblower statutes that might apply. And we can file preliminary injunctions to prevent the government from seizing the documents or interfering with legitimate historical research. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly dampened when Dr. Mitchell's phone rang. She answered it with a frown that deepened as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "That was my supervisor," she said after hanging up. "I've been placed on administrative leave pending a review of my research activities. Apparently, someone filed a complaint claiming I've been conducting unauthorized investigations using tribal resources." The message was clear. The government was already moving to isolate Marcus from his allies. If they could remove Dr. Mitchell from her position and discredit her professionally, it would be much harder for Marcus to find people willing to help him. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," David said. "They're going to systematically target anyone who supports you. We need to move faster than I'd like, but we don't have much choice." Professor Rodriguez was already on her phone, speaking rapidly in Spanish to someone on the other end. When she finished, she turned back to the group with renewed determination. "I just spoke with a colleague at the Smithsonian. He's agreed to examine your documents immediately, but we need to get them to Washington within the next 48 hours. If the Smithsonian authenticates them, it becomes an official part of the historical record. How do we get them there without the government intercepting them?" Marcus asked. "We don't send the originals," David said. "We make high-resolution digital copies and send those through multiple channels. Even if they intercept one set, others will get through." As they worked out the details of their plan, Marcus noticed a commotion outside the Cultural Center. Through the window, he could see Chairman Winters arguing with Agent Reynolds and several other officials. The conversation looked heated, with Winters gesturing angrily while the agents remained coldly professional. "Looks like the tribal government isn't entirely on board with the federal pressure," Dr. Mitchell observed. Marcus wasn't surprised. Chairman Winters had always been a pragmatist, but he was also fiercely protective of tribal sovereignty. Having federal agents operate freely on reservation land without going through proper tribal channels would be seen as a serious insult to his authority. The argument outside ended with Agent Reynolds and his team leaving, but Marcus could see the tension in Chairman Winters' posture as he entered the Cultural Center. The tribal chairman looked older than Marcus had ever seen him, as if the weight of impossible choices was wearing him down. "Marcus," Winters said without preamble, "we need to talk. Privately." Professor Rodriguez and David Kim exchanged glances with Dr. Mitchell before gathering their materials and stepping into another room. Marcus found himself alone with the man who had been like an uncle to him growing up, but who now seemed caught between loyalty to his people and pressure from forces beyond his control. "Those federal agents just informed me that if you don't sign their agreement by noon today, they're going to declare the documents you found to be stolen federal property," Winters said. "They'll get a warrant to search every building on the reservation until they find them." Marcus felt his stomach clench. "Can they do that?" "They can try. And even if we fight it in court and eventually win, the process could take years and cost the tribe more money than we have. Marcus, I've been tribal chairman for 15 years, and I've never seen the feds this determined to suppress something, which means what I've found must be really important." Winters sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Your grandfather came to see me 3 weeks before he died. He told me about the documents, about what they proved. He also told me he was planning to leave the decision about what to do with them up to you. What did you tell him?" "I told him he was putting an impossible burden on an 18-year-old kid. I told him some secrets were meant to stay buried." Winters looked up at Marcus with tired eyes. "But he said something that's been haunting me ever since. He said that if we don't stand up for the truth when we have the chance, we're no better than the people who covered it up in the first place." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Those words sounded exactly like something his grandfather would say. Blunt, uncompromising, and cutting straight to the moral heart of an issue. "So what are you telling me to do?" "I'm telling you that whatever you decide, the tribe will stand behind you. It might cost us and it might get ugly, but your grandfather was right. Some truths are too important to stay buried forever." The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming. He'd been prepared to fight this battle alone if necessary, but knowing that Chairman Winters and the tribal government supported him changed everything. It meant he wasn't just one young man with some old documents. He was part of a community that had been fighting for justice and recognition for over a century. When Professor Rodriguez, David Kim, and Dr. Mitchell returned to the room, Marcus told them about his conversation with Winters. The change in their demeanor was immediate and dramatic. "If the tribe is officially supporting this investigation, we have much more legal protection," David said. "Tribal sovereignty gives us some shield against federal interference. And it means we can use tribal resources to protect and preserve the evidence," Dr. Mitchell added. "The Cultural Center has secure storage facilities and professional conservation equipment." Professor Rodriguez was already back on her phone, this time speaking with contacts at other universities. "I'm setting up a consortium of historians and archaeologists to examine your evidence. By tomorrow evening, we'll have preliminary authentication from at least 3 independent sources." As noon approached, Agent Reynolds and his team returned to the Cultural Center, but this time they were met by Chairman Winters, flanked by the tribal attorney and several other council members. The federal agents still had their warrant, but executing it would now require a confrontation with the elected government of a sovereign tribal nation. Marcus watched from inside the building as the two sides faced off in the parking lot. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the frustration on Agent Reynolds' face as Chairman Winters calmly explained whatever legal obstacles the tribe was putting in his way. After 20 minutes of tense negotiation, the federal agents retreated to their vehicles. They didn't leave the reservation, but they also didn't attempt to execute their warrant. It was a standoff, but it bought Marcus and his allies the time they needed to get the evidence safely documented and distributed. "That won't hold them for long," David warned. "They'll be back with more warrants and more pressure. We need to be ready to go public within the next few days." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. In less than a week, he'd gone from being a grieving teenager trying to sort through his grandfather's belongings to being the focal point of a confrontation that could reshape how Americans understood their own history. But as he looked at the faces around him, Dr. Mitchell with her scholarly determination, Professor Rodriguez with her academic credentials, David Kim with his legal expertise, and Chairman Winters with his political courage, Marcus realized he wasn't facing this alone. His grandfather had trusted him to make the right choice, and now Marcus was surrounded by people who shared that trust and were willing to fight alongside him. The truth about the massacre was finally going to come to light, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it might be. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the conference room of a San Francisco law firm, surrounded by historians, archaeologists, lawyers, and journalists. The walls were covered with enlarged photographs of Lieutenant Morrison's journal, military dispatches, and the pictographs from the cave. What had started as one young man's discovery had transformed into a major historical investigation involving experts from across the country. Professor Rodriguez had worked around the clock to coordinate the authentication process. The Smithsonian had confirmed that the documents were genuine 19th century military records. Carbon dating of the journal paper matched the time period, and handwriting analysis confirmed that Lieutenant Morrison had indeed written the entries. Most importantly, a team of archaeologists had used ground-penetrating radar to survey the canyon location described in the journal and had found evidence of a mass burial site. "The geological surveys are conclusive," Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead archaeologist, explained to the assembled group. "There are definitely human remains buried in that canyon, and the soil composition suggests they've been there for approximately 150 years. The location matches Morrison's description exactly." David Kim had assembled a legal team that included civil rights attorneys, federal prosecutors interested in historical justice cases, and even international human rights lawyers. The consensus was clear. The evidence Marcus had discovered documented a war crime that had been covered up by the U.S. government for over a century. "What makes this case unique," explained federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, "is that we have contemporary documentation from a military officer who witnessed the massacre. Most historical war crimes cases rely on circumstantial evidence or oral testimony that was recorded decades after the fact. This is real-time documentation by a participant who was clearly traumatized by what he'd seen." But it was journalist Michael Santos from the Washington Post who asked the question everyone was thinking: What's the government's response been? Are they still trying to suppress this? Marcus looked at David Kim, who had been fielding calls from federal agencies all morning. They've escalated, David said grimly. Yesterday, they got a federal judge to issue a restraining order claiming that any public disclosure of this information would threaten national security. They're arguing that the canyon site is part of a current military installation and that revealing its location could aid terrorists. That's ridiculous, Dr. Foster protested. It's an archaeological site with historical significance. There's nothing there that could threaten current security. The location isn't really the issue, Professor Rodriguez said. They're afraid of the precedent this would set. If one 19th century massacre can be exposed and prosecuted as a war crime, it opens the door to examining other covered-up incidents from the same period. Marcus had been listening to the discussion with growing unease. The more experts who became involved, the more complicated everything became. What had started as a simple desire to honor his grandfather's memory and uncover the truth about his family's history had turned into a major legal and political battle. What if we compromise? He asked suddenly. What if we agree to keep the exact location secret but still release the historical documentation? The room fell silent. Finally, David Kim shook his head. It doesn't work that way, Marcus. Once we acknowledge that parts of this story need to stay secret for national security reasons, we give them ammunition to suppress the whole thing. Either the truth comes out completely, or it stays buried. Dr. Mitchell, who had been quietly reviewing the documents, looked up with a troubled expression. There's something else we need to consider. I've been going through some of my grandfather's papers. He was a tribal elder in the 1950s, and I found references to government agents visiting the reservation periodically to ask questions about certain families. What kind of questions? Questions about bloodlines, about which families might have connections to Captain Jack's band. It looks like the government has been monitoring potential descendants for decades, probably to make sure no one ever found evidence like this. Marcus felt a chill run through him. You mean they've been watching my family for my entire life? Probably longer than that. Your grandfather knew he was being watched. That's why he was so careful about how he preserved the evidence. He spent 70 years planning for this moment, making sure the documents would survive even if something happened to him. The weight of that realization was staggering. Marcus had always known his grandfather was a careful, thoughtful man, but the idea that Joseph Crow Feather had spent his entire adult life protecting a secret, this dangerous while raising a grandson in the shadow of government surveillance, was almost impossible to comprehend. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Michael Santos leaned forward. Now we publish the story. My editor has already cleared space for a major feature in Sunday's edition. Once it's in print, they can't suppress it anymore. And then what? What happens to me after the story comes out? The room was quiet for a moment. Finally, David Kim spoke. Honestly, Marcus, we don't know. You'll probably be famous, which brings its own problems. There will definitely be legal challenges, congressional hearings, maybe even criminal prosecutions of current officials who were involved in the cover-up. Your life is going to change completely. Marcus thought about the quiet life he'd been living just a week ago, sorting through his grandfather's belongings and trying to figure out what to do after high school. That life seemed impossibly distant now. What would my grandfather want me to do? Dr. Mitchell smiled for the first time in days. I think you already know the answer to that question. Marcus nodded. She was right. He did know. Joseph Crow Feather had spent 70 years protecting this secret specifically so that his grandson would have the choice to reveal it when the time was right. The old man had believed that truth and justice mattered more than safety or comfort. Okay, Marcus said. We publish the story. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity. Michael Santos worked with his editors to craft a comprehensive article that would be impossible to ignore or discredit. Professor Rodriguez coordinated with academics at other universities to ensure that peer-reviewed articles would follow shortly after the newspaper story. David Kim's legal team prepared for the inevitable court challenges that would come as soon as the story was published. Meanwhile, federal pressure on the reservation continued to intensify. Agent Reynolds and his team maintained a visible presence, conducting what they called routine security checks, but which everyone understood to be intimidation tactics. Several tribal members reported being approached by federal agents asking questions about Marcus and his family history. Chairman Winters called an emergency tribal council meeting to address the situation. Marcus was invited to attend, and he found himself standing before the elected representatives of his people, explaining why he believed the truth about the massacre needed to come out, despite the risks it posed to everyone involved. "Our ancestors died for this land," Marcus told the council. "They died fighting for the right to live as free people, to tell their own stories, to be remembered as human beings, rather than obstacles to progress. If we stay silent about what happened to them, we're letting their killers win a final victory more than a century after the fact." The council voted unanimously to support Marcus's decision, even though they knew it would bring unwanted federal attention to the reservation and could complicate ongoing negotiations about casino rights and federal funding. That night, Marcus sat in his grandfather's house for what he knew might be the last time. Tomorrow, the Washington Post would hit newsstands with a front-page story that would change American history. By the end of the week, every major news organization in the country would be covering the story, and Marcus would be at the center of a national controversy. He looked at the framed photograph of his grandfather that sat on the mantelpiece, the one that showed Joseph Crowfeather as a young man in military uniform. For the first time, Marcus understood the expression in his grandfather's eyes. It wasn't just confidence he saw there, but the kind of quiet determination that came from knowing you were fighting for something bigger than yourself. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, grandfather," Marcus said aloud. "I hope this is what you wanted." Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of the reservation at night, but he knew that by this time tomorrow, everything would be different. The secret that had been buried for over a century was finally going to see the light of day, and there would be no going back. 6 months after the Washington Post published the story that changed everything, Marcus stood on the rim of the canyon where his ancestors had been murdered. The site was no longer secret or forbidden. Congressional hearings had forced the government to declassify the location, and it was now protected as a National Historic Landmark. A simple stone monument marked the mass grave, inscribed with the names of the victims that scholars had painstakingly identified from tribal records and military documents. The story had exploded across the media, exactly as everyone had predicted. Within hours of publication, every major news organization was covering the discovery of Lieutenant Morrison's journal and the evidence of the 1874 massacre. The initial government response had been predictably defensive, claims that the documents were forgeries, that the archaeological evidence was inconclusive, that national security prevented full disclosure of certain details. But the evidence had been too overwhelming and too well documented to suppress. Professor Rodriguez's academic consortium had published peer-reviewed articles in multiple historical journals. The Smithsonian had put the documents on public display. Most damaging to the government's credibility, a whistleblower from the Department of Defense had leaked internal memos showing that officials had known about the massacre for decades and had actively worked to keep it secret. The congressional hearings that followed had been brutal and thorough. Agency after agency had been forced to admit that they had suppressed historical evidence to avoid legal liability and political embarrassment. Agent Reynolds and several other officials had been forced to resign, and criminal investigations were ongoing into who had authorized the cover-up to continue for so long. For Marcus, the attention had been overwhelming, but ultimately positive. The settlement money the government had originally offered to keep him quiet paled in comparison to the book deals, speaking fees, and college scholarships that came from being at the center of one of the biggest historical revelations in decades. More importantly, he had become a symbol for young Native Americans who were fighting to preserve their cultures and tell their own stories. But today, standing at the massacre site with Dr. Mitchell and Chairman Winters, Marcus wasn't thinking about fame or money. He was thinking about the people who had died here, about his great-great-grandmother Winona, who had watched her family murdered and somehow found the strength to save her infant son. "Your grandfather would be proud," Chairman Winters said quietly. "He carried this burden for 70 years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on to someone who could handle it." Marcus nodded. but he was still processing the magnitude of what had happened. The discovery hadn't just exposed a single war crime, it had opened up a broader examination of how the government had treated Native Americans during the westward expansion. Other tribes were coming forward with their own evidence of covered-up atrocities, and historians were re-examining the official records of dozens of military campaigns from the 1800s. "What's the latest from the legal team?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "The wrongful death lawsuit is moving forward," Marcus replied. "David Kim thinks we have a strong case for damages even though the crime happened so long ago. The precedent would be huge. It would establish that the government can be held accountable for historical crimes, even if they were covered up for decades." But beyond the legal implications, Marcus had come to understand that the real victory was simpler and more personal. The truth about what happened to his family was finally part of the historical record. Winona and her murdered relatives were no longer forgotten victims. They were documented examples of the real human cost of westward expansion. The government's attempts to suppress the story had backfired spectacularly. Instead of keeping the massacre secret, their heavy-handed tactics had drawn even more attention to it. The image of federal agents trying to intimidate an 18-year-old Native American had become a powerful symbol of institutional racism, and the lengths to which powerful people would go to avoid accountability. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from Professor Rodriguez, who was now coordinating a major archaeological project at the site. Preliminary excavations had confirmed the presence of at least 37 bodies, including women and children. More importantly, they had found artifacts that corroborated Lieutenant Morrison's account of the massacre: military buttons, shell casings, and personal items that painted a vivid picture of what had happened on that terrible day in 1874. "The university wants to create a research center here," Marcus told his companions. "A place where students can study the real history of the Indian Wars, not just the sanitized version that's been taught for over a century." Chairman Winters smiled. "Your grandfather always said that education was the best weapon against ignorance and hatred. He'd love the idea of young people coming here to learn the truth." As they prepared to leave the canyon, Marcus took one last look at the monument. The stone was simple and unadorned, but the names carved into it represented something profound: the power of truth to survive even when it's buried under layers of lies and bureaucratic cover-ups. His grandfather had understood something that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. Some secrets were too dangerous to reveal carelessly, but they were also too important to stay hidden forever. Joseph Crowfeather had spent his entire adult life waiting for the right moment and the right person to carry the truth forward. He had chosen well. The drive back to the reservation took them through the same hills where Captain Jack's band had once roamed freely. The landscape looked exactly as it had for centuries, but Marcus saw it differently now. This wasn't just beautiful country. It was the homeland his ancestors had died defending. Every ridge and valley held stories that were finally being told truthfully. Back at the Tribal Cultural Center, Marcus found a crowd waiting for him. Reporters, academics, and tribal members from across the country had come to hear him speak about the ongoing investigation. But tonight's gathering was different from the formal interviews and academic conferences he'd been attending for months. This was his community, his people, and they had come to honor not just his courage in revealing the truth, but his grandfather's wisdom in preserving it. Dr. Mitchell had prepared a presentation about the historical significance of the documents, but it was Chairman Winters who captured the real meaning of what had happened. "For too long, our history has been written by our enemies," he told the crowd. "They told the world that we were savage obstacles to progress, that the violence against us was justified, that our culture and our people didn't matter. But tonight we know that at least one piece of that lie has been exposed. One massacre that was supposed to stay hidden forever is now part of the official record." Marcus found himself thinking about all the other secrets that might still be buried, all the other families who carried hidden truths about government crimes and cover-ups. His story was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of historical lies that were finally being unraveled. As the evening wound down, Marcus walked back to his grandfather's house, though it was his house now, along with everything else his grandfather had left him. The government surveillance had ended after the story broke, replaced by a different kind of attention from historians and journalists who wanted to interview the young man who had exposed one of the biggest historical cover-ups in American history. Inside the house, Marcus sat in his grandfather's favorite chair and opened the leather-bound journal he'd been keeping since the story broke. Tonight's entry would be simple but important. The truth is finally free. Grandfather, your long vigil is over. The dead can rest now, knowing they haven't been forgotten. Outside, the reservation was quiet under a canopy of stars that had witnessed everything. The original beauty of the land, the violence that had scarred it, the decades of silence that had followed, and now the long-overdue reckoning with truth. Marcus closed the journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to ensure that the lessons of the past were never forgotten again. The secret that had been buried for 150 years was finally, permanently part of the light.